The house was really quiet.
Is that unusual?
Yeah.
And when you realized it was really quiet, what did you do?
I called out
And who did you call out to?
everyone.
Did anyone answer?
No.
Duxbury, Massachusetts, January 24th, 2023, 6:39 in the evening. Patrick Clancy pulls into the driveway of his own home, and something is already wrong before he even opens the door. The first thing he notices is the silence. He climbs the stairs. His bedroom door, locked. Not normally locked. He gets it open. Blood, pooled in front of the mirror. The window standing open to the January cold. He doesn't stop to process it. He's already moving, already outside, already scanning the dark yard below that open window, and there she is. His wife, on the ground. He asks her what happened. "I tried to kill myself," she says. He asks her the only question that matters now. "Where are the kids?" "In the basement," she tells him. He is about to walk into the worst 30 seconds of his life. He doesn't know it yet. This is the case that made detectives, prosecutors, and an entire medical system stop and ask the same question. How does a mother who spent years training to save lives end up accused of taking 3 of them inside her own home, on what her husband would later call one of their best days in months? Lindsay Clancy wasn't a stranger to crisis. She'd built her career on it. As a labor and delivery nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the top hospitals in the country, she spent her working life on the other side of emergencies, the person who showed up when things went wrong and made them right. Her case has since renewed national attention on perinatal and postpartum mood and anxiety disorders, conditions that affect new mothers at rates far higher than most people realize. By the time investigators finished piecing together January 24th, 2023, they weren't just looking at a crime scene. They were looking at a woman who had been prescribed as many as a dozen different medications in the months leading up to that night. A husband who says he was never once warned to leave her alone with their children, and a defense that would eventually argue this wasn't murder committed with intent. It was a mind that had been chemically and psychologically taken apart, piece by piece, until January 24th arrived. Over the next several minutes, we're going to walk through exactly what happened that day. The moments before, the discovery, the call that a judge ruled too disturbing for the public to hear, and the questions this case has forced investigators, prosecutors, and mental health professionals across the country to confront. Every detail here is drawn from court filings, sworn testimony, and verified reporting. Nothing here is speculation. By the end, you'll understand why this isn't just another true crime case. It's the case that made people question whether the system meant to protect mothers like Lindsay Clancy failed her, and failed her children, long before that January evening ever began. Before any of this had a case number, it had a beginning, and it starts almost 300 miles from Duxbury, on a quiet street in Wallingford, Connecticut. That's where Lindsay Marie Musgrove grew up, in a neighborhood people would later describe as close-knit, the kind of place where neighbors had watched her grow up and still recognized her parents by name years later. Her parents, Paula and Mike Musgrove, still lived on that same street, and neighbors who'd known the family for years described them as wonderful, kind people. Lindsay went on to Quinnipiac University, and from there into nursing, not casually, but through an accelerated nursing program at Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the more demanding tracks into the profession. She stuck with it. She worked as a labor and delivery nurse at MGH for 9 years, a career people close to her describe as something she genuinely loved, spending her working life helping other families through the most vulnerable moment of new parenthood. It was in the summer of 2013, while she was still in nursing school and living with a cousin of his, that she met Patrick Clancy. Patrick took her on a first date to fly kites, and not long after, introduced her to his family. The relationship moved at a steady, unremarkable pace, the kind that doesn't make headlines, which is exactly the point. Patrick proposed on New Year's Eve of 2015 at the site of their first date, and they married in December 2016. Their daughter Cora arrived first, born on Christmas Eve of 2017. Their son Dawson followed roughly a year and a half later, in September 2019. Somewhere in between, while Lindsay was pregnant with Dawson, the couple bought a home in Duxbury, Massachusetts, a coastal town on the South Shore, the kind of community people move to specifically to raise children. Patrick worked in tech sales, eventually landing a role at Microsoft, splitting time between business travel and a home office in the basement of that same house. Lindsay kept working her hospital shifts, building a life that, from the outside, looked settled. In May 2022, their third child was born, a son, Callan. This is the detail worth sitting with, because it's the hinge the entire case turns on. Everyone who knew this family before Callan describes the same thing. Patrick's mother, Susan Clancy, told a grand jury that Lindsay was a fun-loving, doting wife and mother who loved her kids and smiled all the time. This wasn't an isolated read. It was the consistent picture from people who'd spent years around her. Lindsay had dealt with postpartum anxiety before, after both Cora's and Dawson's births, and each time, she managed it the way many new mothers do, with exercise, meditation, and therapy. It didn't derail her. It didn't change how people around her described her. 2 children in, she'd faced this exact challenge and come out the other side. That's the family that existed before January 2023. A nurse, a tech salesman, 3 kids, a house on the South Shore, and a documented pattern of a mother who struggled after childbirth and recovered every time. What happened after Callan's birth broke that pattern completely, and that break is where this case truly begins. The unraveling didn't happen overnight. It happened in stages, each one documented by doctors, by text messages, by the people around her who watched it get worse and tried, repeatedly, to help. After Callan's birth in May 2022, the anxiety Lindsay had managed twice before came back, but this time it didn't look the same. She went through a period of hypomanic behavior, heightened energy, elevated mood, before it flipped into the opposite, debilitating anxiety and insomnia, so severe she was sleeping only around 3 hours a night. This was no longer the pattern that exercise and therapy had fixed twice before. Something had changed. Over the following months, records show she was placed on as many as 13 different psychiatric medications over a 4-month stretch, an aggressive, layered course of treatment for a condition her providers hadn't yet correctly diagnosed. Her defense attorney would later describe what he saw in blunter terms. He said Patrick went to a doctor the week before the killings and told them, turning her into a zombie. In November 2022, with things already fraying, Patrick left for a 2-day work trip to New York City. A day into it, he and Lindsay had a phone call, barely a minute long, where she told him she'd heard a voice commanding her to kill their children, and that it was her last chance. "She didn't sound like my wife," he would later say. That call should have been the moment everything changed. It didn't stop there, but it also didn't end the way you'd expect. On New Year's Eve, weeks before the killings, Patrick took Lindsay to the hospital after she told him she was having thoughts of wanting to die, felt numb, and admitted to intrusive thoughts of harming their 3 children. The next morning, she was admitted to McLean Hospital, a psychiatric facility outside Boston. Days into her stay, she texted Patrick, "I don't belong here." 5 days after admission, she told doctors the intrusive thoughts were gone, and she was discharged with a prescription for an antidepressant. 2 days after coming home, the family threw a 5th birthday party for Cora at a trampoline park. Lindsay had been sleeping better. Her mood at the party gave Patrick hope her condition was improving, and by his own account, it seemed to give her hope too. For the next 3 weeks, that hope appeared to hold. Patrick would later testify things had genuinely improved through January, steadily getting better, in his words. He believed it enough to make a decision no one flagged as risky at the time. He'd never been told, by any of her providers, not to leave her alone with the children. Then came January 24th, 2023, the day Patrick would later call one of their best in months. That morning, Lindsay took 5-year-old Cora to a pediatrician appointment, where medical staff noticed nothing unusual about her behavior. Afterward, she and the kids built a snowman in the yard, and she texted photos of it to her mother and to Patrick. It was an ordinary winter afternoon. Nothing about it looked like a warning. Then, prosecutors allege, Lindsay did something specific. She used the Maps app on her phone to calculate exactly how long it would take Patrick to drive to a restaurant and back. She then asked him to pick up children's medication from a CVS pharmacy and take out from 3V Restaurant in Plymouth. A trip prosecutors say was deliberately longer than his usual errand run. Patrick had no reason to hesitate. He got in the car and left the house. He would be gone 25 minutes. 25 minutes. That's how long Patrick Clancy was gone from his own home on the evening of January 24th, 2023. 25 minutes is nothing. It's a commercial break. It's the length of time most people spend deciding what to watch next. For the Clancy family, it was the entire window in which everything changed. When he pulled back into the driveway and walked through the door, the first thing that hit him wasn't a sight. It was an absence of sound. The house was quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of kids napping or watching a show. A wrong quiet. The kind that makes a parent's body react before their mind catches up. He moved through the house calling out for his family. Nothing answered him. He went upstairs first, the bathroom, the kids' bedrooms. Empty. Then his own bedroom door, and something immediately off about it. The door was locked, which it never was. He got it open. Inside, he found blood in front of the mirror and the window standing open to the January air. He didn't step further into the room. He turned and went back outside, moving toward the one place that might explain what he'd just seen. In the backyard, directly below that open second-story window, he found Lindsay on the ground, alive, but seriously injured, having apparently slit her wrists and neck before jumping. He asked her what happened. "I tried to kill myself," she told him. He called 911, and then he asked the question that would define the next several minutes of his life. "Where are the kids?" Lindsay replied, "In the basement." He left her with the 911 dispatcher's instructions and ran for the basement stairs. He called out, "Guys," and then what followed on that recording was him screaming in agony and shock as he found his children, one by one. He found Cora first, in the main living room area of the basement, face down. Around her neck, an exercise band. He got it off. Each child still had the band used to strangle them tied around their necks when he found them, and moved to the next child, lying close by. Callan, 8 months old, in the same condition. Then he had to search for the third. Dawson wasn't with his siblings. Patrick checked the bathroom, checked around the couch, before finally finding his 3-year-old son in the home office, the same office Patrick himself worked from most days. He removed the bands from each of them and begged them to breathe. Paramedics arrived and took over. Patrick was sent upstairs, out of the basement, away from his children, with nothing left to do but wait and answer more questions from dispatch. Cora and Dawson were pronounced dead at the hospital that same night. Callan, the youngest, held on for 3 more days before he died as well. 25 minutes. A locked door. A quiet house. That's what was waiting for Patrick Clancy when he came home with dinner. Officers Stephen Hall and Brian Josephine were dispatched separately to Summer Street in Duxbury that evening. When Hall arrived, Patrick Clancy was yelling for help from behind the house. Lindsay Clancy was semi-conscious on the ground in the backyard, her pupils constricted, and none of the cuts on her wrists or neck were actively bleeding. The cold and snow, the defense would later suggest, may have played a role in that. For a few critical minutes, first responders' attention was split, treating a badly injured woman in the snow while, just feet away and 1 floor below, 3 children lay dying. Then Patrick's voice cut through everything. "I can't wake them up. I can't get them up." Officers left Lindsay with paramedics and ran for the basement. Hall went down first and found 3-year-old Dawson lying on the floor, shirtless, his skin discolored. He and Officer Josephine carried the boy outside to waiting EMTs, then went back down to check for the others. That's when Hall found 2 children on the basement floor, motionless, with paramedics already working on them, Cora and Callan. A Duxbury Fire Captain, P.J. Hussey, arrived in time to look through a basement window and see Patrick himself trying to unwrap something from around a child's neck. It turned very chaotic very quickly, he would later tell the jury. What followed was a coordinated, desperate fight to save 3 lives at once. Paramedic Patrick Dwyer treated Cora in the basement, then continued CPR, oxygen, and attempted defibrillation during the ambulance ride. She never regained a pulse. Paramedic Jennifer Stratton began chest compressions on Callan immediately and, by her own account, scooped the infant up in her arms and carried him out to the truck herself. Duxbury Fire Captain Keith Nettie worked on Dawson, CPR, intubation, epinephrine, advanced cardiac life support, and never got a pulse back either. Cora was pale when first responders reached her. 3 ambulances, 6 towns worth of emergency crews, and every medical intervention available weren't enough to undo what had happened in those 25 minutes. At the hospital, the fight continued. Doctors tried to restart Dawson's heart for 40 minutes, adrenaline, calcium, every measure available, and it would not start again. He was declared dead at 7:28 that evening. Callan arrived with his heart already stopped, CPR still in progress, receiving air through a bag valve mask. Doctors later confirmed that on the Glasgow Coma Scale, the standard measure of consciousness and brain function, Callan registered the lowest possible score. At no point did he show any brain activity at all. Cora and Dawson were pronounced dead that night. Callan was flown to Boston Children's Hospital, where he held on for 3 more days before dying on January 27th. Word spread through Duxbury almost immediately. The town's fire department later released a statement acknowledging what their own people had witnessed. Our thoughts and prayers are with the victims of this tragic event, their family members, and all the members of our public safety community who responded. Within days, hundreds gathered for a candlelight vigil at Holy Family Church, praying not just for the Clancy family, but for the first responders who'd carried those children out. 3 years later, when several of those same responders took the witness stand to describe what they'd seen, the toll was still visible. One officer removed his glasses more than once during his testimony, wiping his eyes. These weren't people recounting a case file. They were describing the worst night of their careers, and they hadn't fully put it down since. There is a 7-minute recording at the center of this case that the public will likely never hear. On the second full day of testimony, jurors were played the 911 call Patrick Clancy made from his own backyard on January 24, 2023. It runs about 7 minutes, starting with Patrick finding Lindsay badly injured outside the house, and ending with him discovering what she had done to their children. Before it was played, Judge William Sullivan had already ruled that while the jury could hear it in full, the recording itself could not be released to the public or broadcast. That ruling means something specific for anyone following this case. There's no audio to play you, no clip to embed, no transcript circulating that's been verified as complete. What exists instead is the account of the people who sat in that courtroom and heard it directly. On the recording, Patrick can be heard telling Lindsay to wake up when he finds her on the ground outside their home. She responds only in moans, struggling to form words. Once paramedics arrive and take over her care, Patrick stays on the line, still talking to the dispatcher, and goes looking for his children. That's when the call turns into something else entirely. He can be heard repeatedly screaming after finding them in the basement. In the courtroom, Lindsay Clancy sobbed as the recording played. Across the room, witnesses would later describe her covering her face, appearing to sob and shake, as medical staff described what they'd done trying to save her children's lives. This is the moment this case has been defined by in the public conversation, not because people have heard the call, but because of what its existence and its restriction represents. A father's rawest, most unguarded 7 minutes, deemed too devastating for public consumption, sealed by court order. The jury heard it. The people in that room heard it. Everyone else is left with only their accounts. The day after the recording was played, testimony shifted to the first responders who'd lived through the same scene from the other side of the phone line. The people whose voices Patrick was hearing, and who were racing toward a house they didn't yet know the full horror of. What the restriction ultimately protects isn't a secret about what happened. Every fact, the timeline, the injuries, the outcome, has already been established through testimony, filings, and reporting. What the court order protects is the sound of it, the specific, human, irreproducible sound of a father learning, in real time, that his children are gone. That's the piece of this case that stays behind closed doors, not because the facts are unknown, but because some things, even in the pursuit of justice, are judged too raw to broadcast. This case had already tested the emotional limits of a courtroom long before opening statements began. During jury selection alone, dozens of prospective jurors asked to be excused, some becoming visibly emotional. The court kept a tissue box within reach the entire time. That was the temperature of the room before anyone had heard a single piece of evidence. Before the 911 recording was played, Judge Sullivan gave the jury a direct instruction. It's natural to feel horror or empathy in the face of facts like these, he told them, but their decision has to rest on the evidence, not the emotion. He repeated the caution as the call began. It didn't hold, not entirely, not for everyone in the room. The recording ran close to 6 minutes. Jurors heard Patrick asking his wife where the kids were, asking if she'd fallen from the window, asking what was on her neck. Then his voice changes. He tells the dispatcher he's going to check on the children, and moments later, he can be heard howling and crying after finding them in the basement, while a confused dispatcher keeps asking what happened. Lindsay Clancy leaned forward, put her head in her hands, and sobbed as it played. She wasn't alone. Many jurors were visibly emotional, enough that Judge Sullivan called a recess once the recording ended. Legal analysts described the tape as devastating, leaving several jurors shaken and wiping away tears, the kind of emotional force that could shape how a jury processes everything that follows in a trial. A veteran local reporter covering the trial, someone who had spent more than 4 decades in the business, said afterward it was one of the worst things he'd heard in his entire career, and admitted he needed the recess as much as anyone in that room. The jury then heard brief, almost procedural testimony. Employees from the CVS pharmacy and the restaurant Patrick had visited that evening. A quiet aftershock following the loudest moment of the trial so far. A retired Superior Court judge watching the case from outside said afterward that there was never a real question the prosecution would play that recording for the jury. It was, in his words, always coming. The strategic risk cuts both ways. The tape makes the horror undeniable, but it also risks a jury's sympathy tilting toward the man on the other end of that call, the same man the defense would need, later, to help make their case for who Lindsay was before any of this happened. That tension between the rawest possible evidence of harm and a defense built on explaining how a mother capable of none of it ended up here is exactly where this case goes next. During cross-examination, defense attorney Kevin Reddington approached Patrick with noticeable gentleness, at one point telling him to say if the questioning became too difficult and offering to pause if he needed it. It was a deliberate choice. One retired prosecutor watching the trial called it smart strategy, noting that Patrick Clancy is likely the most sympathetic witness in this entire case, and the defense needed him as an ally, not an adversary. Reddington spent that afternoon asking Patrick about Lindsay's parenting, including the photos and videos she'd posted of their children online, building toward a specific picture, a loving mother, not someone capable of this while in her right mind. He also had Patrick walk through, in detail, the mental health care Lindsay had sought before January 24th. This wasn't a new argument. Susan Clancy, Patrick's mother, had already told a grand jury that Lindsay was a fun-loving, doting wife and mother who loved her kids and smiled all the time. The defense's broader position has been consistent from the earliest hearings. Lindsay struggled with postpartum anxiety after both of her first 2 children, but managed those symptoms successfully with exercise, meditation, and therapy, until a period of hypomanic behavior followed Callan's birth, which then gave way to debilitating anxiety and severe insomnia. Reddington has been direct about what he believes actually happened in the months leading up to the killings. Over-medication, not malice. He's pointed to the fact that Patrick himself went to a doctor the week before the tragedy and told them, "You're turning her into a zombie." According to Reddington, Lindsay's own parents were aware of how dire things had become and were trying to help support Patrick through it as well. Records cited in reporting show Lindsay was on as many as 13 different psychiatric medications over a 4-month period, an extraordinary pharmaceutical load layered on top of a new mother already struggling with sleep and anxiety. Patrick has said none of her providers ever warned him about postpartum psychosis specifically, a condition that, according to the Maternal Mental Health Leadership Alliance, is rare but has been linked to roughly 1,000 cases of women incarcerated in the U.S. for homicides committed in the first year after giving birth. Patrick's own position on his ex-wife has remained, by his own account, unusually forgiving for a man who lost 3 children this way. "I wasn't married to a monster," he told The New Yorker in 2024. "I was married to someone who got sick." He has also filed a wrongful death lawsuit on behalf of his children's estates against some of Lindsay's healthcare providers, alleging she received a rapid succession of psychiatric prescriptions in the months before the killings and that her deteriorating condition wasn't managed appropriately. Those claims haven't been proven in court, and the medical providers named will have the chance to contest them. But the lawsuit reveals something important about where Patrick has aimed his anger. Not entirely at Lindsay, partly at the system that was treating her. None of this erases what happened in that basement. It complicates it, deliberately, And that's exactly the point the defense is building toward. A woman capable, by every account from the people who knew her longest, of being a devoted mother, until a medical crisis nobody around her fully understood took that capacity away. Here's the fault line running under the entire prosecution case. Prosecutors have argued from day one that Lindsay Clancy planned the murders and faked her own suicide attempt, that the wounds on her wrists and neck, and even the fall from the window, were staged to look like a genuine attempt on her own life, when really they were cover for a premeditated act. The evidence they've built that theory on is specific. When Officer Hall found her in the snow, none of the cuts on her wrists or neck were actively bleeding. Reddington, on cross-examination, suggested the cold weather that night might explain that, reduced blood flow, snow, exposure. But there's a harder problem for the prosecution's theory sitting right next to it. A legal analyst following the case pointed out the obvious tension. If Lindsay had only cut her wrists and neck, the staged theory holds together cleanly. But she also jumped from a second-story window, and that single additional act undercuts the idea that any of it was performance. You don't throw yourself out of a window for show. Then there's a moment from the trial that may matter even more than the suicide attempt question. A discrepancy that has nothing to do with motive and everything to do with what the physical evidence actually shows. A courtroom demonstration by the prosecution, meant to challenge a forensic pathologist's account of how the exercise bands were used to strangle the children, appears to have backfired, reportedly contradicting the crime scene evidence and Patrick's own testimony. One legal analyst pointed to the specific problem. Patrick had unequivocally testified that the bands were tied, like tying a shoelace but skipping the loop, and that he'd had to untie them by hand. The prosecution's demonstration didn't match that account. According to that analyst, the misstep may have cost the prosecution some of the jury's trust. There's a second discrepancy, subtler but just as pointed, buried in the medication evidence. Prosecutors showed jurors 9 prescription bottles that still contained pills, direct evidence. They argued against the defense's claim that Lindsay was dangerously overmedicated in the lead-up to the killings. One analyst summarized the prosecution's likely argument plainly, that Lindsay and her doctors were actively trying to get her better, and the fact she wasn't taking every medication all at once at maximum dose undercuts the picture the defense wants the jury to see. 2 competing versions of the same set of facts. The defense says a woman was buried under 13 medications in 4 months, turned into what her own husband called a zombie. The prosecution says, count the pills still in the bottles. That's not what overmedication looks like. Both can point to real evidence. Neither can fully explain away the other's strongest point. That's the discrepancy this case still hasn't resolved, and it's likely to be the exact question the jury is left arguing about behind closed doors. After 14 days of testimony, prosecutors rested their case against Lindsay Clancy on August 17, 2026. 2+ weeks of witnesses, first responders, forensic examiners, psychiatric providers, phone forensics, the medical examiner, all building toward one core argument, that Clancy acted intentionally, rationally, and swiftly when she killed her children and then staged what looked like a suicide attempt. The defense didn't waste any time countering that narrative. The same day the prosecution rested, Lindsay's mother, Paula Musgrove, was called as the defense's first witness, a deliberate choice, leading with someone who could speak to Lindsay's state of mind in the direct run-up to the killings, not just her history as a mother. Musgrove testified about a conversation with Lindsay and Patrick just weeks before the tragedy, recalling that Lindsay denied feeling suicidal but admitted she was close to it. The defense's broader case has been building around one specific medical narrative for months now. Forensic psychiatrists have diagnosed Clancy, after the fact, with bipolar disorder and postpartum psychosis, a rare condition that can fundamentally alter a person's sense of reality. Jurors have also seen notes recovered from Lindsay's phone, including one written in late December 2022 and last edited the day before the killings. Medication stole my motherhood and my life, it read, adding, I was the healthiest, happiest mom. I worked out every morning, meditated, and took care of myself so I could be the best for my kids. Not everything on that phone helps the defense, though. Prosecutors pointed to a search made just 4 days before the killings. Can you treat a sociopath? A phrase they've used to suggest a very different state of mind than the one the defense describes. The lead prosecutor has pushed back directly on how this case is being framed publicly, urging jurors not to treat the trial as, in her words, a public debate about women's mental health and how the medical system treats women. It's a telling line, an acknowledgement that this case has already grown into something bigger than the courtroom itself, shaping conversations about postpartum psychiatric care nationally, whether the prosecution wants that framing or not. Some legal analysts watching closely have suggested the prosecution's case has picked up real setbacks along the way, pointing specifically to the failed courtroom demonstration around the exercise bans as a moment that may have cost them credibility with the jury. Whether that assessment holds up will depend on how the rest of the defense's case lands, and how the jury weighs weeks of forensic and medical testimony against the sheer weight of what happened in that basement. The trial was expected to run 6 to 8 weeks from its start in late July, with a witness list once totaling more than 200 names. Though, as with most trials, the actual number of witnesses called has been far smaller. As of now, the defense's case is underway, built around psychiatric testimony, medical records, and the people closest to Lindsay in the months before January 24, 2023. A verdict is still weeks away. Here's what we're left with. A father who lost 3 children in 25 minutes and still says he doesn't believe he married a monster. A mother who doesn't dispute what her hands did, only whether her mind was hers when she did it. A jury of 12 women and 6 men who will have to decide, based on pill counts and phone notes and courtroom demonstrations that didn't go as planned, whether this was calculation or catastrophe. If Lindsay Clancy is convicted of murder, she faces life in prison without the possibility of parole. If the jury finds her not criminally responsible, she'll be committed instead to a state mental health facility. Either outcome closes one door and opens another. For Patrick, for the Musgrove and Clancy families, for the first responders who still can't fully put that night behind them, and for the wider conversation this case has forced about how the medical system treats new mothers in crisis. We don't have that answer yet. The defense's case is still underway, built around psychiatric testimony and the people who knew Lindsay best in the months before the killings. And closing arguments, jury deliberation, and a verdict are all still ahead. This is exactly why we called it the case that made detectives, prosecutors, and an entire medical system stop and question everything they thought they understood about risk, warning signs, and what postpartum mental illness can actually look like from the outside. There was no red flag anyone caught in time. That's the part of this story that should unsettle you most. We'll be back the moment this jury reaches a verdict, walking you through exactly what they decided and why. If this case matters to you, if you want to understand how it ends, make sure you're subscribed, because you are not going to want to miss how this one is decided.